Welcome to the Continuing Education module, selecting the right program model for your organization, choosing the strategy that fits best. The agenda for this module includes the following topics. First of all, we'll look at the choices of models, which includes the feel-good model, the traditional model, and the results-driven model. Then we're going to look at considerations for each that have implications for our choice, and the advantages and disadvantages of each. Then one approach to the choice, and then some important decision points, and finally a summary of key points. First of all, your choices include these three basic models, and you have been exposed to those through the WellCert program, but let's highlight the feel-good wellness model is basically a fun orientation, very little risk reduction or health behavior change, very little high risk focus, so the individual with multiple health risk is not necessarily served by this particular model, nor is it very health cost management oriented. It is basically all volunteer on all voluntary activity, site-based activities only, so there isn't a lot of at home or on the road or from other points of access. Very little personalization, very minimal incentives, very few spouses served, and basically no evaluation to speak of. And again, the primary focus of this kind of approach to wellness is a morale improvement orientation. The traditional model has mostly a health focus. It has some risk reduction, some high risk individual focus, limited health cost management orientation, all voluntary, usually related to the primary site and the site where employees are to access the wellness activities. Fairly weak personalization of programming, weak tailoring, weak ways in which the program adjusts to individual preferences and individual circumstances. Modest incentives, so we're up in the area of maybe $50 to $150 of incentives of different types. Few spouses served, fairly weak evaluation because there's not any activity that collects information consistently from the entire population. So we tend to have a weak evaluation base. And this particular kind of approach to wellness is more of an activity-oriented approach. The results-driven wellness model adds a productivity emphasis to the basic health focus that the program has. It becomes much more behavioral change oriented and also has a strong emphasis on risk reduction, a strong high risk focus, strong health cost management orientation, some required activities, perhaps in the area of completion of a well-being assessment or the participating in some type of educational exposure to the wellness program, its purposes and its activities and benefits and so on. Some site and virtual both, so the ability to not only be site-based in the delivery of wellness services, but to reach the individual through virtual means, which includes things like phone systems, smartphone, SMS messaging, coaching activities conducted in a home, a variety of e-health portal access, other kinds of offer opportunities. So usually much more strongly personally focused, driven by a lot of the information collected in a well-being assessment, and also including major incentives. This is where we're looking more at the perhaps $600 to $1,200 per year of value that is arranged around meeting a number of wellness criteria. Many spouses served, so this program model tends to be reaching out more inclusively into the spousal population. More rigorous evaluation because we are collecting information from everyone. We're looking at patterns and trends. We're mapping or scoping out participation, but also health risk and well-being assessment findings, but being able to look at a much more rigorous approach to evaluation. And again, this particular model is the results driven. And again, our perspective here is that these are actually clusters of activities that are on a continuum. And we want to match our purposes and reasons and goals for the program and expectations of management with the choice of model. So this particular module is really working on how would you choose among these three different types of major program models. Now, some of the major considerations are going to be the desired health effects of your wellness program. What kind of health improvement do you want? Desired health plan effects. So if we're looking at changing utilization patterns, or if we're looking at changing cost patterns and medical trend, then that becomes another consideration for choice of model. We also have a desired employee reaction. So we want to be aware of what our expectations are from the wellness effort in terms of providing and meeting any employee reaction, or having that reaction meet a desired expectation on the part of management. So again, that's one of the considerations in choosing the model. We also have the desired budget resources we want to spend on wellness. So we have that particular consideration in terms of choice of model. We also have the desired administrative demands. How much staffing and how much staff time and employee time are we willing to contribute to a wellness program? We also have a desired overall priority for wellness. How important is it in the context of all the other issues that the company or the organization is going through? You have the desired economic impact. So you have the issue of, are we also want to affect our health plan costs? Or do we want to affect sick leave absenteeism, or workers' compensation costs, or disability insurance costs, short-term and long-term, and or presenteeism costs? And our desired community role in terms of what we want the wellness program to reflect about us as an organization. And how does that role play out? What kind of a corporate citizen are we? And what kind of community connections do we in fact want to maintain and or enhance? And finally, the desired long-term purpose of the program. So if you're positioning this as a way to work on your human capital and to improve the quality of that human capital and its productivity over time, then that becomes another issue that comes into play when we think about what are the considerations for the choice of the three models we looked at initially. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of each, let's take them one at a time. First of all, in the feel-good wellness program model, some of the advantages are it's easy to do. It's a good starting point in terms of beginning your journey on wellness with employees. It's low cost, very little commitment in terms of longer-term commitment or organizational integration-oriented commitment. So very limited commitment. And from a disadvantage side, unfortunately, it's not very effective. So this particular kind of approach to wellness is really more of a morale-oriented approach rather than something that's going to materially change the health and or any of the economic parameters that we generally think of with wellness. So very little return on investment. So we're not likely to expect any kind of impact on our health plan cost or sick leave or workers' comp or disability insurance costs or presenteeism related costs. Also potentially misleading in the sense that if I'm doing this kind of wellness and I'm not been clear with management, it can mislead management to think that there's supposed to be more results oriented or results provided by this particular kind of activity. And it's relatively small amounts of long-term results. So this kind of activity does not produce a lot of behavior change or a lot of risk mitigation and or issues around health improvement or health status improvements. Now, in the traditional model, the advantage is there's very little controversy with putting out a lot of different activities and choices for employees. It's a very common model. It's the most common model. That's why we call it the traditional approach. Very little accountability. So the advantages of that are that there isn't really a lot of expectation that I should have with this particular kind of activity-oriented, participation-oriented wellness program. Some level of effectiveness. So we can in fact look at various hierarchy of results for these programs and see some effectiveness. Now on the disadvantage side, this is lots of work. So we're basically rolling out things. It tends to be a much more tactical orientation to wellness, not necessarily strategic, but more tactical in nature. It does not provide a lot of data on the population, so limited data, limited effectiveness. So it has some effectiveness, but not a lot, and relatively low participation if we are not doing some things to either increase the novelty effects about the program and or structure incentives so that it guides and has high levels of participation. Participation is a proxy for effectiveness. So if we're not serving a lot of people or they're not participating in the program, then it's not likely that their health is improving and or their economic return is there. Now, in the results-driven wellness model, one of the advantages is it's a very effective model. Secondly, it has high economic return, and that goes across all 5 of the economic variables: health plan costs, sick leave, workers' comp, disability insurance, which includes short and long-term, and presenteeism-related costs. It can lead to some significant health improvement, so we can document that when we are using this kind of program model. And on the disadvantage side, it requires a strategic commitment. So I have to do more than just vendorize my program, have a vendor come in and do a tap here and a tap there. This requires a more strategic commitment. It requires more investment. So my budget for this kind of wellness has to be higher. And it also has a higher level of demand for employees. So employees are faced with more serious wellness issues. Not so much I can take it or leave it, but in the results-driven wellness model, we are providing some compelling reasons through incentives for a large proportion of the population to engage in wellness. So these are some of the major advantages and disadvantages of each of the 3 major program models or strategies for wellness. Now, one approach to the choice might include the following things. First of all, clarifying management desires, finding out what's the consensus of your management around wellness. And it's best for you to do that with them as a group rather than as individuals, because you will see the individual preferences rather than the group or collective or consensual areas of expectations and desires around the program. You also want to gain senior management consensus with that set of desires. So you want that to be confirmed. So that means either through conversation or through emails and or written documents or PowerPoint decks, you in fact are gaining some recognition and agreement from senior management. Usually it should involve some sort of prioritization of program goals, because it's very important that you know what are the priorities that management has given to the various program goals so that you know which model to emphasize in terms of achieving the goals that management has for the program. Fourth issue and fourth approach to the choice of model is for you to review the 3 models and become very familiar with them. So the idea that you really want to clarify that there are different ways of doing wellness, and you want your senior managers to understand the implications of those models. Then adopt the first-year program model and plan. Then adopt the plan for years 2 through 5. So it gives you an opportunity to think about how the program might in fact change or evolve over time. I'm going to show you some patterns in a moment that really addresses this issue of what do you do to think through how the model changes over time as you evolve the program and as your organization experiences there's those years of wellness. And then you want to implement and position your program accordingly. So these again are some ways for you to be able to think about how this choice might actually be made. And finally, you can evaluate and smooth the transitions. So you can kind of look at how this might be done in a way that provides some formative evaluation feedback about modifying the program in future years, and also how to smoothly make many of those transitions. So in summary, this is one approach for how you might go about making the choice of the right program model and fitting that with your organization's needs. Now, the important decision factors in this are: one, how severe are our health cost pressures? Are we experiencing a high level of concern? Does the lighthouse, is it focused on the issue of health costs and how much future health costs are going to have to be dealt with and how they're going to be dealt with? The extent of the economic interests beyond healthcare costs, to include sick leave, workers' comp, disability, and presenteeism. The follow-through capability of the organization. Are they good at being able to follow through on more taxing or more challenging types of programming, more complex programming that requires some thought for consistency and continuity? The level of employee trust and management. So if employee trust is very low, and there's a great deal of suspicion, then it's harder for a wellness program to actually produce results. The past experience with the wellness activity. So if there's been good past experience or historical experience, then you're likely to be looking at the future and being able to be more expansive in your planning and your thinking. Another important decision factor are leadership norms. Are the leaders in the organization at the mid-level as well as the senior management level, are those norms strong enough for wellness in those groups? Will they participate? Will they support the program? What are their past experiences in doing that? And what can we expect out of them in the coming years? And then finally, another important decision factor is their vision for the future. What are they doing? Are they just holding everything in place organizationally, or do they have some vision for where they want to take the organization? Does wellness fit into that vision? Those are all issues that are important issues, as you see the list here, of the decision factors that are going to influence your choice of which model you end up choosing. Now, some implications of wellness strategies. Let's take a look, first of all, at the feel-good wellness model. And that's oftentimes very group activity or event-oriented, tend to be more fun and social event-oriented. Usually a stronger emphasis on the awareness part of AMSO, and then a light focus. So the focus is not real intense, it's not real heavy, it kind of comes and goes. Limited testing activities, much more orientation to how people feel about their employer. Very few spouses served by this kind of model. It is the lowest cost model, and it's got, unfortunately, some minimal effectiveness associated with it. And it is, in fact, the easiest to do. So I can do this if I'm not taxed with a lot of other issues or challenged. I can, in fact, do this particular model fairly well. In the traditional wellness model, it's both group and individual focus, more health emphasis, education and information, awareness, attitude oriented, kind of a mixed focus. It can be intensive in some areas, like maybe the preventive screening or biometric testing, and then a lighter in terms of the use of a learning management system and or apps that are designed to be on your smartphone and help you track your physical activity. So a very mixed focus in terms of what programming is done. Moderate role for testing and what we call the health management process. So we have the ability for people to engage and provide feedback about their activities, but we also need to recognize that it's not a real heavy focus. It also is more oriented toward knowledge building, not just morale building, but thinking about people's health literacy and health care literacy. These are major concerns of the National Academy of Sciences, and a recognition that our nation really needs a lot of work in building our literacy around both health as well as health care. Few spouses served, moderate cost, so we're in that moderate cost category, moderate effectiveness, and moderate difficulty. So those are, again, are some of the implications that help us connect with these different models. In the results-driven model, it's mostly an individual focus. It has some cultural and normative change issues, but we really are focused heavily on providing a fairly extensive set of compelling activities for the individual to engage in. More risk emphasis, so we're attempting to not just focus on the positive side of health, but also what are those things that need attention on the individual's part, and how do we build awareness around those. It is more behavior oriented rather than education oriented or awareness oriented. It tends to be a more serious focus. So the issues here will be usually broader range of prevention targets and a more serious approach to wellness. Fairly heavy testing activities. Skill building, so if we look at the knowledge building and morale building, our skill building emphasis comes out in the results-driven wellness model, and that's where we're really trying to help people develop a range of wellness and well-being skills. Most spouses served, so we tend to include and want to be more inclusive in the family, the employee's family, as well as our ability to serve people who may in fact be on our health plan. It's got a higher cost associated with it. It's got a higher level of effectiveness, but it's also got a higher level of difficulty. So as you look across each of these models, it should help you get a better sense of what each of these kind of approaches to wellness has as some of the major implications in our choice of a particular strategy. Now, the typical programming pattern we're going to look at is you do feel good for 3 years, you then transition into the traditional model and then into results driven. So that's a very typical kind of model that I have seen in the industry. Another one is I do feel good, but then I start immediately into more extensive sets of activity, and I'm activity oriented. So that's what you see in terms of the traditional model, and then ending up with a results driven at some point in time. And this, by the way, the numbers of years you spend in each model are really, related to your goals, the resources, and the kinds of considerations that we just talked about. Another pattern would be a traditional, jumping right into the traditional, bypassing the feel good, and then into a results-driven model. So the issues around the choice of that results-driven in this C pattern is really driven more by a concern for the economics of wellness and the desire to do more in terms of impacting in a positive way on the health of employees. D is I do the traditional for a period of time and then I make my move to the results driven. And E, I start right with the results driven model and I move ahead with it. So the ability for us to have that as our way of handling and working on this. So if you think about it, the A and B are really kind of the beginning points for many organizations. C and D tend to be the places where people are either staying in that traditional, and I've known programs that have stayed traditional for 20 plus years. So there's nothing that requires the movement from one model to another. It's really the issue of how well is it meeting our goals and expectations about wellness and about the human capital improvement that we want to do with a workforce. Now, the tips for transition include you want to communicate the purpose of the program, you want to provide feedback on employee use of the program, and that sets the stage for you to talk about change and shift in model with employees. You can also have a desire for greater reach and participation that you're stating to people. You're asking them, you're appealing to them to actually take part in the program. There's also that expanded vision for wellness, so I can broaden my prevention targets, the issues that I'm addressing, as well as begin to enrich my program by shifting models. And if this happens in terms of the level of usage or involvement in program, then we will expand, or we will consider building a fitness facility or having a fitness facility leased on our property. So it's setting up that tips for transition as you look at one kind of model to another. And then you can talk about the next year positioning. So you're talking about this year, if we're in a feel-good mode, you're getting used to it. Next year, we'll lay out a series of activities and options for you. We're going to expand our menu. And then the year after that, or the year after that, then we may in fact want to put in more powerful incentives and move toward integrating wellness more deeply in our culture. So it is using these kinds of statements to help with the tips for transition from one model to another. Now, a summary of key points for this particular CE module. There are clearly different ways of doing wellness. We need to inform people about that because they produce very different results and consume very different levels of resources. The 3 program models illustrate some of the most important differences. So what we've tried to do is to use the models to really identify what are those attributes or characteristics associated with wellness that really do need to be clarified as early as possible. Prioritized program goals are very helpful in selecting the appropriate program model. So if I know that the economic issue is a high level of concern for management, then I'm going to steer the organization toward more of a results-driven, or between a hybrid between traditional and results-driven. A rational process for selection of the appropriate program model is of critical importance. So the ability for us to have a process that is in fact very carefully put together does in fact lead to a better outcome. Each program model has some clear advantages and disadvantages. Hybrid program models are inevitable. So we do in fact see movement in between, and we are moving in a direction toward one or more of the models. Programs can transition as organizational needs change. Critical issues in choice of program model include employee trust, follow-through capability, and economic need. And communication is key to smoothly changing the program model from one year to the next. Positioning of the wellness effort is critical for both management and employees. The 3 strategies or program models help to keep expectations and effort in balance. And finally, the strategies represent an excellent shorthand for program advocates. So you can in fact be an advocate around wellness and help people get clearer about their expectations, their desires, and how each of the various models fits into the situation. Now let's answer a few questions. First of all, our first question is, does the issue of the program model only come up when you start the program? And I would say an emphatic no. You should be talking about the program in terms of the model that you're using all along the way. And particularly at times like budget times or evaluation or employee rollouts, those are all times when the type of model you're talking about should be explained to both the employees as well as management representatives. The second question is, are there different champions for the different program models? And I believe there are. If I were to think about the feel-good model, oftentimes I see the champion being the HR, the VP of HR or director of HR. Employee relations will sometimes be the champion for this particular kind of wellness. The safety people can in fact be involved in that as well. And a chief operating officer may in fact be the champion for the feel-good type of model. The traditional model oftentimes has the HR person as the major champion for that. And that also may include the CEO, where the CEO wants to see a lot of activity and choices laid out. So those are oftentimes different champions, again, for the wellness effort. With the results-driven model, the champion sometimes will be the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. It may be the benefits manager. It also may be a medical director. and or the CEO if the CEO understands some of the issues around the differences in the models. So there are different champions for the different program models. Third question is, what is an appropriate end game as we think about this whole issue of the model of programming? And I'd like to suggest to you that I would suggest that you scope out the next 3 to 5 years by the model or strategy and actually get consensus agreement from your management team about that process. Almost like what we saw in terms of those three-dimensional little graphics or icons around the three models in different patterns. Secondly, I think that it's good for you to think about, how do I make smooth transitions? How do I communicate about those transitions in terms of changing the approach we're using with wellness? The third issue is, I want to generally grow novelty each year. So I want to use the different models as a way of introducing some novelty, and then I want to introduce new topic areas or new ways of approaching things or a variety of new choices and new options as part of the way that I introduce and maintain a high level of novelty. Novelty helps with my program because it causes more people to take part in it. If I keep the program the same and there's no novelty, I will generally see participation go down. The fourth issue is, I want to add some activities and then subtract some other activities. So each year I'm going to be looking at what should be added and what should be dropped. And then lastly, I want to be able to do some evaluation that helps me really determine how well is the program working. And I would then want to give that feedback both to management as well as to the employees that are affected by the program. So those are some thoughts about how we might in fact think about the end game use of these different organizational models or strategies around wellness programming. Now that you've completed this particular module, go ahead and take the quiz.